Assalamu alaikum, grade 4. Today we're going to read through chapter 9. The fur trade. David Thompson was important to the fur trade. He was a map maker during that time. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, he kept notes about his travels across Canada. He included fascinating details about his location, the environment, and the people he met. My dad treasures his copy of a thick, old book grandfather gave to him. The book is called David Thompson's Narrative of His Explorations in Western America. Joseph B. Tyrrell took responsibility for getting the book published. The page edges are very jagged. Dad said old books used to be made with their page edges folded over. This meant the very first person who read the book had to slice the pages open. I think that would have been fun. Another special thing about this book is that the back cover has pouches with copies of 4 large fold-out maps. There are also color copies of the pictures David Thompson made while on his travels. I'm sure he had many adventures on his map-making explorations. Part of a big highway running through the foothills region and leading to the mountains is named after David Thompson. I asked Dad about one of the maps in the book that was drawn by somebody else. It was dated 1784. This was the year Thompson first came to Canada to work. I couldn't figure out this map. I could see the Hudson Bay and the Pacific Ocean were too close together. The map had a few river systems marked, but it also had a lot of empty spaces. So as you can see in this picture, in the map, most of the edges are marked out, but the middle has a lot of empty spaces. Find the Hudson's Bay and the Pacific Ocean. Study the land in between. How does this map compare to a map of Canada today? Dad told me that back then, map makers knew little about the middle or interior of Canada. I knew First Nations people lived in this area and were very familiar with the geography. But there were no towns or European settlements. I wondered how much David Thompson had added to our knowledge of the interior. Did the fur traders need maps like those made by David Thompson? Dad said if we could explore these questions, we should be ready, he said, to find all sorts of interesting answers. I think we might also find a few stories. So why do you think that maps at this time were less detailed in the interior and more detailed on the outside of the map? As you can see along the borders, it's very detailed. This is because settlers who were arriving to Canada at this time arrived along the borders, and they knew more about the borders than they did about the interior because it took a lot of time for people to travel into the middle and begin to map out these areas. The start of the fur trade. The fur trade began in eastern Canada where the French built the first fur trade posts. First Nations people brought furs from the interior. They traded them for European goods such as pots and cloth. Francophone coureurs de bois, or runners of the woods, from what is now Quebec, also traveled to the interior for fur. In the summer, First Nations people came to what is now Montreal to trade furs for goods. This painting was done by George Agnew Reed in 1916. The skins of beavers and other animals were sold in Europe. They were turned into a thin, shiny material similar to felt. This waterproof, bendable material was used for hats and fashion. Felt hats like this one were made from beaver skins. Hudson's Bay Company. In 1670, the King of England gave the Hudson's Bay Company trading rights in Rupert's Land. This was not discussed with First Nations people in the area. Rupert's Land included the area with river systems draining into Hudson's Bay. It covered about one-third of present-day Canada. Most of what is now Alberta was in this area. Trading forts were built at the mouths of rivers flowing into the Hudson's Bay. The forts housed the traders' goods and furs. The forts often had stockades, high fences made of poles stuck in the ground. This helped provide protection against attack from other fur traders and First Nations groups who were their rivals. So, just a question. Why do you think that trading forts were built at the mouths of rivers? So people at this time would build trading forts at the mouths of rivers because this, the first reason would be because it provided easy access for people to the forts. People could travel by canoe and use water to travel. Also, it was easier to transport materials this way. Transporting materials by land took a lot of energy for these people. In 1670, the Hudson's Bay Company held trading rights and built trading forts in Rupert's Land. Anthony Henday. Anthony Henday was hired by the Hudson's Bay Company. In 1754, he was asked to paddle up the Saskatchewan River. His goal was to persuade the First Nations people who were buffalo hunting to bring hides to the Hudson's Bay posts. On his journey, Anthony Henday traveled further west than any European explorer before him. The First Nations people told him that they did not want to make the journey north to the Hudson's Bay. The Hudson's Bay Company did not reward or recognize Anthony Henday's efforts because he did not meet his goals. In 1762, he quit the company. So why do you think an Edmonton road is named after Anthony Henday? So Anthony Henday was a European explorer. He traveled very far west and he made a trip to visit First Nations people. He paddled all the way up the Saskatchewan River. Once he made it there, the First Nations people told him they did not want to make the journey. After he arrived back, the Hudson's Bay Company refused to recognize him or reward him for what he did. Because of this, a road in Edmonton is named after Anthony Henday. The fur trade brings change. When the French and English began to settle in what would become Canada, they competed with each other for land and furs. Some First Nations were already enemies before the Europeans arrived. Their partnerships with either the French or the English increased their conflicts. Another change brought by the fur trade was new goods that were exchanged with Europeans for furs. First Nations people had traditionally used natural resources to meet their needs. They started to use trade goods to make their lives easier. Trade goods changed their way of life. They began to use metal pots. They began to wear wool and cotton clothing. Metal blades replaced stone tools. Many First Nations people started to rely on the trading posts for goods. By 1764, Piikani people were using a calendar called Winter Count. They used symbols and figures to show the most outstanding event of each year. This winter count represents a first contact between European traders and some Piikani people. It's shown here in this image. Trade goods. So First Nations people traded things such as furs of beaver, fox, and wolverine. Hides, meat, horses, animal fat, and pemmican were also traded by the First Nations people. Fur trading companies traded metal goods such as guns, traps, knives, and pots, wool blankets and cotton cloth, beads, tobacco, liquor, tea, sugar, and flour. So here's a quote by Joe Mackenzie. Trade goods were like candy. People knew they could live quite well off the land by fishing or hunting moose, woodland caribou, beaver, and spruce grouse, but tea, tobacco, and sugar made life more enjoyable. So the reason the First Nations and European people wanted to trade with each other is not because they needed to trade to live. They traded because it made their quality of life more enjoyable. So having things like sugar and tea made them happier overall. So you can think, how did the traditional ways of life change for the First Nations people after trading began? All of these things that they traded for, they didn't have access to before. They didn't have things like guns, traps, knives, or cotton. So a lot of these things made them have a better quality of life. Aboriginal contributions. Many Aboriginal people acted as guides for explorers and traders. Early maps included much information they had provided. First Nations people had established trading routes and contacts long before Europeans came. They helped the Europeans set up the fur trade. Aboriginal people brought furs to the Hudson's Bay Company forts to trade. Many Métis men traveled to the interior for the fur trading companies. They were interpreters, helping the Europeans and First Nations communicate. They hunted buffalo. Métis and First Nations women made pemmican. It was light to carry and did not spoil, so it was an ideal food for fur traders. So pemmican is a type of Métis food which is made from animal fat and sometimes berries. So it gave these people a lot of energy. The Aboriginal people made canoes using birch bark. They taught the Europeans how to use canoes. Canoes were light and easy to use. They could be portaged or carried over land. When the waters were rough, they could also be overturned to provide shelter. So, canoes were ideal at the time because they were easy to use. They could be carried easily over land because they were not too heavy. The Northwest Company. Over time, competition from Quebec fur traders increased. They worked for merchants in Montreal and Quebec, not for fur trade companies. They used canoes to travel to First Nations people. Eventually, some of these traders began to join together. By 1783, they officially formed the Northwest Company. Together, they built their own forts. Peter Pond, for example, built a trading post on the Athabasca River in 1778. The company hoped to get furs from the Aboriginal people before they reached Cumberland House, a Hudson's Bay Company fort. So as you can see in the picture, Quebec traders were competition for the Hudson's Bay Company. They also competed with each other. Sometimes conflicts arose and some became violent. So there was a lot of competition between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. So these were two fur trading companies that were competing with each other. To compete, the Hudson's Bay Company started building trading forts nearer to the First Nations hunting grounds. Métis voyageurs worked for them, traveling to the interior. So Métis people also worked for the Hudson's Bay Company and the fur trading companies, and they were able to easily travel into the interior of Canada, which was hard to access. Because of how large Canada is, it takes a lot of time to get into the interior or the middle areas of Canada at the time. The voyageurs. So, the Northwest Company was run by Scottish merchants in Montreal. They hired francophone voyageurs from Quebec and local Métis voyageurs. The voyageurs were strong, hardy men who were skilled at paddling canoes. The voyageurs transported trade goods from Montreal up the river system to the forts. After trading, they transported loads of furs back to Montreal.